Welcome to The Midnight Secrets. The Haunting of Blackwater Bay. The small, coastal village of Blackwater Bay had always been shrouded in an air of mystery. Nestled against the rugged cliffs of Maine, the village was known for its bleak, foggy weather and the cold, unyielding sea that surrounded it. The people who lived there were hardy, used to the harsh conditions and the unforgiving ocean that was their lifeblood. But they were also superstitious, and for good reason. The sea was a capricious mistress, and the tales of the ghost ship that haunted Blackwater Bay were as old as the village itself. Tom Larson was a young fisherman, born and raised in Blackwater Bay. He had grown up hearing the stories, the whispered warnings from the elders, and the hushed conversations that took place in the corners of the local tavern. But like many young men, he was skeptical. He had seen his fair share of storms, faced down the treacherous waters of the bay, and he had come out unscathed. The idea of a ghost ship seemed far-fetched, a tale spun to keep the younger generation in line. It was late summer when Tom decided to test his luck. The fishing had been good that year, and Tom was eager to make the most of it. The fog had rolled in thick that evening, blanketing the village in an oppressive gray. The older fisherman had already called it a night, but Tom was determined to bring in one last haul. The fog didn't bother him, he had navigated these waters his entire life. As he pushed his small boat, the Sea Star, out into the bay, the fog swallowed him up, the village disappearing from view within moments. The sea was eerily calm, the only sound the soft lapping of the water against the hull of his boat. Tom cast his nets, the routine motions comforting in the thick silence that surrounded him. But as he waited for the nets to fill, a sense of unease began to creep over him. The air was colder than it should have been, a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. Tom shook off the feeling, focusing on his task. He had just begun to haul in his nets when he saw it, a dark shape looming in the fog. At first, he thought it was another boat, perhaps one of the older fishermen who had come to check on him. But as the shape grew clearer, Tom's heart began to race. It was a ship, but not like any he had ever seen before. The vessel was massive, with tall, tattered sails that flapped in the windless night. The wood of the ship was dark and rotting, as though it had been submerged in the ocean for centuries. As the ghostly ship drew nearer, Tom could see figures moving on the deck. They were pale, almost transparent, with hollow eyes that glowed an eerie green. The air around Tom grew colder still, his breath visible in the night air. The ghostly crew turned their attention to him, and Tom felt their eyes bore into him, filled with a malevolence that made his blood run cold. The ghostly ship began to close in on the Sea Star, the temperature dropping even further as it approached. Tom tried to pull in his nets, but they were caught on something deep below the surface. Panic set in as he realized that the ghost ship was dragging him and his boat towards the dark depths of the bay. The mournful wails of the ghostly crew filled the air, a chilling sound that seemed to seep into Tom's very soul. The spectral ship loomed closer, its rotting hull almost within reach. Tom could see the ghastly figures more clearly now, emaciated, with faces twisted in eternal anguish. Some had missing limbs, while others bore the marks of wounds that had never healed. They reached out with skeletal hands as if beckoning him to join them in their watery grave. Desperate, Tom tugged at the nets with all his might, but they were firmly snagged. The force pulling his boat towards the ghost ship was growing stronger, the Sea Star creaking and groaning under the strain. The mist around him thickened, wrapping itself around the boat like a shroud. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. With the ghost ship nearly upon him, Tom knew he had only seconds to act. In a frenzy, he grabbed his fishing knife and began hacking at the ropes of the net. Each cut felt like it took an eternity, the ghostly wails growing louder, more insistent. The Sea Star jolted as the last of the ropes snapped, and Tom was thrown to the deck. He scrambled to his feet, not daring to look back as he rushed to the boat's controls. The engine sputtered to life, and Tom pushed the throttle to full, steering his boat away from the approaching doom. The ghost ship was now so close he could smell the stench of decay that emanated from it. He could feel the cold emanating from the ship, a cold that seemed to sap the strength from his limbs. As the sea star sped away, Tom cast one last glance over his shoulder. The ghost ship had stopped its pursuit, hovering just at the edge of the fog. The ghostly crew stood motionless, their glowing eyes following Tom's retreat. The ship began to fade, dissolving back into the mist as if it had never been there. The wailing ceased, and the air warmed slightly, but the terror remained with Tom, gnawing at the edges of his mind. When Tom finally reached the shore, he was a changed man. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he tied up his boat, and his legs felt like jelly beneath him. The villagers who had been waiting for him at the dock rushed over, their concern etched on their faces. But Tom could barely speak. He managed to mutter something about the ghost ship, but his words were jumbled, incoherent. It wasn't long before the news of Tom's encounter spread throughout the village. Some dismissed it as the ravings of a man driven to the brink by the fog and the cold, but others knew better. They had seen the look in Tom's eyes, the hollow, haunted expression of someone who had come face to face with something beyond human understanding. Tom never returned to the sea after that night. He sold the Sea Star and moved inland, far from the coast, where the only water he saw was in the rivers and lakes that crisscrossed the countryside. But even there, he was not at peace. The memory of that night haunted him, the ghostly ship and its crew appearing in his dreams, dragging him back to Blackwater Bay. As the years passed, the legend of the ghost ship grew, passed down from one generation to the next. Fishermen avoided the bay on foggy nights, and those who did venture out made sure never to stray too far from the shore. They knew that the ghost ship was out there, waiting, searching for the next soul to drag down into the cold, dark depths of Blackwater Bay. The Curse of Devil's Reef. Devil's Reef was a place that inspired fear and fascination in equal measure. Located off the coast of Louisiana, the reef was notorious for the many ships that had been wrecked on its jagged rocks. The waters around the reef were treacherous, with powerful currents that could pull even the strongest ships off course. But there was something more sinister that kept most fishermen far away, a dark legend that had haunted the area for centuries. The story of Devil's Reef was a tale of greed, betrayal, and supernatural retribution. According to the legend, the reef had once been the hideout of a group of pirates, led by the infamous Captain Lucien Leblanc. Leblanc was a ruthless and cunning man, known for his brutality and his insatiable hunger for wealth. He and his crew had plundered ships from the Caribbean to the Gulf of Mexico, amassing a fortune in gold, jewels, and other treasures. But Leblanc's greed was his undoing. After one particularly successful raid, the captain decided that he didn't want to share the loot with his crew. He lured them to Devil's Reef, promising them a hidden cave where they could stash their riches. But once they were inside, Leblanc betrayed them, collapsing the entrance and trapping them inside to die. The captain escaped with the treasure, but he didn't get far. A sudden storm capsized his ship, and Leblanc drowned in the very waters where he had betrayed his crew. It was said that the spirits of the betrayed pirates haunted the reef, cursing anyone who came near. Over the years, many ships had been lost in the area, and the bodies of the sailors were often never recovered. The locals believed that the pirates' ghosts were responsible, dragging their victims down to the depths to join them in their watery grave. Despite the warnings, there were always those who were drawn to the reef either by curiosity or the promise of riches. One such group was a crew of 5 men, led by Captain Jack Malone. Jack was a seasoned fisherman, known for his daring exploits and his ability to bring in the biggest catches. He had heard the stories of Devil's Reef, but he was not a superstitious man. To him, the reef was just another place to fish, and he believed that the legends were nothing more than old sailors' tales. It was a stormy night when Jack and his crew set out for the reef. The wind was howling, and the sea was rough, but Jack was undeterred. He believed that the storm would drive the fish into the sheltered waters around the reef, making it the perfect time to strike. The men were eager for a big catch, and they followed their captain without question. As they approached the reef, the sea suddenly grew calm, too calm. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but Jack reassured them that it was just a lull in the storm. They lowered their nets and began to fish, the eerie silence pressing down on them like a heavy weight. The only sound was the creaking of the boat and the distant rumble of thunder. Hours passed, and the men grew restless. The fish weren't biting, and the air was thick with tension. Just as they were about to give up, something massive tugged on the nets, nearly pulling the boat over. Excited shouts filled the air as the men struggled to reel in their catch, but their excitement quickly turned to terror. Rising from the depths was not a haul of fish, but a creature unlike anything they had ever seen. It was enormous, its serpentine body covered in dark, slimy scales that glistened in the dim light. Its eyes were glowing red, filled with a malevolent intelligence that chilled the men to their core. The creature let out a deafening roar, shaking the boat and sending waves crashing over the deck. Panic set in as the men scrambled to escape. The creature lashed out with its massive tail, smashing the boat and sending splintered wood flying in all directions. The men were thrown into the water, and one by one, they were dragged beneath the surface by the creature's long, coiling tentacles. Their screams echoed in the night, carried away by the wind and swallowed by the storm. Only Captain Jack managed to survive, clinging to a small rock outcropping near the reef. He watched in horror as the creature devoured his crew, its monstrous form disappearing back into the depths once it was satisfied. Jack was found the next morning by a passing fishing boat, his clothes soaked and his eyes wide with terror. His once dark hair had turned completely white, and he was unable to speak of what he had witnessed. The legend of the Devil's Reef monster grew stronger after that night. Fishermen refused to go near the reef, and the waters were left undisturbed. Some say that the creature still lurks there, guarding the cursed treasure of the long-dead pirates, waiting for the next foolish soul to venture too close. Captain Jack never returned to the sea. He left Louisiana, moving inland where he could escape the memories of that night. But the curse of Devil's Reef remained, a dark and menacing presence that kept the waters around the reef shrouded in fear. To this day, no one dares to fish near Devil's Reef, for fear of awakening the vengeful spirits that haunt its depths. The Phantom Fisherman of Dead Man's Lake. Dead Man's Lake was a place of eerie beauty, hidden deep within the Alaskan wilderness. Surrounded by towering pines and snow-capped mountains, the lake was known for its crystal-clear waters that reflected the sky like a mirror. But beneath the surface, something dark and malevolent waited. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the Phantom Fisherman, a ghostly figure said to haunt the lake. The legend of the Phantom Fisherman was as old as the lake itself. According to the story, the phantom was the spirit of a fisherman who had drowned there many years ago, his body never recovered. His restless soul was doomed to wander the lake, seeking out the living to drag them down into the icy depths with him. The story began in the late 1800s, when the area around Dead Man's Lake was still largely unexplored. A small group of settlers had made their way to the region, hoping to make a new life for themselves in the rugged wilderness. Among them was a man named Jacob Miller, a skilled fisherman who had come in search of the abundant fish that were said to populate the lake. Jacob was a solitary man, more at home on the water than among other people. He had always been drawn to the quiet solitude of fishing, and Dead Man's Lake seemed like the perfect place for him. The lake was remote, far from the nearest town, and its pristine waters promised a bountiful harvest. For the first few months, Jacob's life at the lake was everything he had hoped for. The fishing was excellent, and he spent his days on the water, casting his nets and enjoying the peace and quiet. But as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, a sense of unease began to creep over him. It started with strange noises in the night, unexplained splashes in the water, distant cries that echoed through the forest. Jacob dismissed them at first, attributing them to the wildlife that roamed the area. But the noises grew louder, more persistent, and Jacob began to feel as if he was being watched. One night, as Jacob was preparing to turn in, he heard a loud splash just outside his cabin. He grabbed his lantern and went to investigate, but there was nothing there. The water was calm, the night still. But as he turned to go back inside, he caught sight of something in the water, something pale and ghostly, floating just beneath the surface. Jacob's heart raced as he stepped closer to the edge of the lake. The figure was that of a man, dressed in old-fashioned fishing gear. His eyes were open, staring blankly up at the sky. But what terrified Jacob the most was the man's face. It was a reflection of his own. The phantom fisherman slowly rose from the water, his body dripping with icy lake water. Jacob stumbled back, dropping his lantern in his haste to get away. The ghostly figure stepped onto the shore, his eyes locked onto Jacob's. He reached out a hand, and Jacob felt a cold, clammy grip around his wrist. Terrified, Jacob tried to pull away, but the phantom's grip was strong. The ghostly fisherman began to speak, his voice low and hollow. He told Jacob that he was cursed, doomed to wander the lake for all eternity. He had once been a fisherman, just like Jacob, but he had met a terrible fate on the lake. Now, he was condemned to drag others down into the depths to share in his suffering. Jacob fought with all his strength, but the phantom was relentless. The icy grip tightened, pulling him closer to the water. Jacob's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to free himself. Just as he thought he would be pulled into the lake, the phantom suddenly released him, disappearing back into the water as quickly as he had appeared. Shaken and terrified, Jacob fled the lake, leaving everything behind. He made his way back to the nearest town, where he told his story to anyone who would listen. But most people dismissed him as a madman, driven insane by the isolation of the wilderness. Jacob never returned to Dead Man's Lake. He left Alaska, moving to the lower 48 states, where he tried to forget the horrors he had witnessed. But the phantom fisherman remained, haunting the lake and claiming the lives of those who dared to fish its waters. The legend of the phantom fisherman continued to grow, with each new disappearance adding to the mystery and fear surrounding Dead Man's Lake. The locals avoided the lake, warning visitors to stay away. But there were always those who didn't believe the stories, who ventured out onto the lake, lured by its beauty and the promise of a good catch.